one of the most important parts about job search and all of this stuff is being brutally honest with yourself. I mean, brutally honest, to the point sometimes where you're like, okay, I'm sure this is fine, but I probably shouldn't have said it that way. Maybe I could have said it slightly differently. Because even if you go a little too far along the spectrum, you're likely picking up a lot of the stuff that you can fix. But it's super valuable to think about, where are the gaps between the absolute perfect candidate and me? Not to beat yourself up, but to say, how can I close those gaps? I'm going to touch on how you can do some of that shortly and where some of the biggest gaps are, and then how to stand out. And this is actually one of those. So let's say, and this is often the gap that people struggle with. So there's no joke about two guys are in the woods and they see a bear, and they start to run. And one guy stops to tie his shoe. The other guy's like moving, but he's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you think you're going to outrun the bear? He says, no, I just got to outrun you. Right? So while I wouldn't necessarily think of the world in quite so like macabre a state of things, what your objective is to be able to go into those interviews and the conversations trying to know more and be more conversant in basic stuff than your competitors. Let me give you an example. Let's say you wanted to get an investment banking internship. We can pick whatever example is. This applies everywhere. But this one will stick with investment banking. I'll have other examples. And you did a reasonable financial services job last summer. The person you're competing with did an investment banking analyst job last summer. That's tough sledding. You're probably not going to encounter it, but for the purposes of this, let's think it through. What is that person's interview going to be like? They're going to be talking about deals they worked on. They're going to be talking about how they did modeling. They're going to be talking about industry they worked on. They're going to show what they've learned. And so they're going to be speaking the same language as the person they're interviewing with. Your job then is to become as fluent in that language as humanly possible. So what that means is, and I sometimes worry about scaring people with this, but if you think about capital markets, you can scale it back with different roles you're looking for, right? So management consulting, iBanking tend to be the most insane things that people try and get jobs for. It's like the most absurd processes often. So if I talk about it in those contexts, as you scale it, think about the concept of that applied to whatever you're interested in. And so build a financial, I was serious. Build a financial model. Learn what are the sensitivities in a DCF? One of the candidates we hired this summer talked about, I did a DCF model on this. And I was like, great, tell me what you found was the most important driver of the DCF. What drove the sensitivity of it in that case? And they were like, well, blah, 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 blah. When I changed this, it didn't really have a big impact because here's how the math worked on that. But when I changed this, it was super impactful. And I'm like, okay, you really get what you've done. Broadly speaking, I meet three groups of people in interviews. Group number one are people who are legitimately really nice people who somehow or other got through the process, but they're not really suited for the job. And it's fairly easy, with no offense to them, to be like, oh, you're probably not the right candidate. The next two groups are the tricky ones. One group is exactly who I want to hire. The other group knows exactly what to tell me. And so I've got to be able to figure out, how do I figure out which is which? And one of the most effective ways is asking follow-up questions. So the candidate I want to hire loves follow-up questions because they get to show what they know. They get to be like, I legitimately love this stuff. You want to geek out on it? Let's geek out on it. And so that person loves to go into the details. So one of the things I encourage people to do is, when you do any of this stuff, anything in an interview, think about what's the follow-up question they might ask to the answer I just gave them. Because you want to be able, I'll give you an example. A more senior person we were interviewing for. And so I asked this person, I said, well, tell me about your investment philosophy. How do you approach investing? And he said, well, I care about, roughly speaking, he said, I care about competitive dynamics in the industry, management, and financials, ROIC returns. And so the first thing I did was say, great, okay, well, so management is one of the hardest things to assess. I'm really curious how you assess them. It's one of your three things. Like, what do you do? And you can see the deer in the headlights as he's like, oh no, I hadn't expected him to ask me that. So he then said something like, we talked to them. And I'm like, I didn't say this, but in my head, I'm like, you're a genius. How come I never thought about talking to the management team? But if he had sort of thought through, what would someone ask me next? He would have been more prepared for that. Then the second angle is the follow-up question, right? So the way I interview people is I will ask related questions that don't require, but you should get consistent answers separated in time. So I'll ask that question right at the beginning. And then later in the interview, I'll say, we're in the stock picking business. Go ahead and pitch me a stock that you think is a good idea. And I'll probably ask people 2 or 3 of those just so you know to have in your back pocket. He pitched them to me, and I happen to know the company, and they had a terrible management team. And so I was like, I don't understand. Like earlier on, you told me that management was like one of the critical things. And he realized he completely botched it, right? But this is a candidate who knew what to say to me, but he didn't, in his gut and his approach, didn't really believe it and approach it that way. And so the follow-up questions, the okay, and what's next, was able to illuminate that, but also illuminate the candidate who could go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And so that's something I'd really encourage you to do.